document what I was learning, different things, or it was pretty new at that time and not many people were using it, like a couple of them like Khan Academy or others were using it. So what I did is I started doing this video series also while I was learning to document whatever what I was trying to like understand from React. You can find this, it's not visible over here, but I'll upload the slides later, but you can still find this. So this is like pretty old, and I was trying to get around like, okay, what all things React is being used about. Around the same time, like as I started using React, I also wrote a book about it, which was I started using it in many of our client applications, and then again just wanted to get an idea of what various applications React is being used, and then kind of documented it in this book. But this is like 5 years ago, so please don't buy it. This is based on React 0.14 version of React, and right now we are about, I think we are around 16.8. So this is pretty old, like when it was initially when React initially came out. So that was a bit about background of like how I got introduced to React, and I want to set the like agenda of what or for whom this talk is about. So a couple of things. What I want to talk in this is targeted towards, if you know React, it will be a breather for you, like what all has changed in the last couple of years and what is upcoming that you can start looking forward to. If you don't know React, this gives you a bit of a history, so you don't need to know everything. I'm not going to go too deep into a lot of technical. I'll try to give some examples, but this talk is not aimed towards learning everything about React. This just gives a highlight of, okay, what all things were there and what has changed, kind of a history of what all changed within React in past couple of years. So React is quite popular today. Like if you note over here, it has, I don't know, 1,23,000 like stars on GitHub. So many people trying to follow it. On NPM, it has like 5 million downloads every week. So it's extremely popular right now. Like many of the big companies, Facebook, everyone is involved or is using React. So it has got like a big developer community right now. But when it was introduced, the whole idea of React, or like when it was introduced, it was kind of controversial. But what got it a lot of popularity is this concept of virtual DOM. So basically in 2013 or 2012, the only ways to do, or like the most popular ways of doing like things which React allow us today were by libraries like jQuery, which you hooked into a DOM and then you manipulated it manually or based on various events. So virtual DOM was this concept where instead of touching DOM, which is like slower to do, like handling or manipulating DOM is always slower, build out this whole manipulation within JavaScript, compute it, and then just send it to the DOM to make the DOM make whatever interactions you do much faster. How many of you have experience like were using jQuery 4 or 5 years ago? So like when you did something like DOM element dot text something, I don't know, some weird things, it used to be pretty non-responsive. So that was one of the reasons like why React picked up a lot. But why people loved it a lot, or like even I loved it a lot, was the whole idea of components. So what components mean is, like, here is an example page from Instagram. This is the Nat Geo page. So here if you see what there are different parts of the page, and here different parts of the page are divided into what are individual components or small units. So here if you see, this photo itself is divided into like in one component, the likes and the comments and all. You can divide a page into small units of small logical units where you display some kind of information. So it was easier in the world, like, okay, everything that you did during those times were always handling parts of the page, some event happening, then manipulate part of the page. So instead of doing that, this was a different way of thinking, like you compartmentalize different things that you do around a page into small components, and then all logic regarding that aspect of that page were limited to, or you started limiting your thinking towards that component. In the beginning, like this was beginning for me when I started looking at React. So this gives a little bit of idea of what it was then. So as I said, like I started also creating videos. So this was around that time. React was basically used via these two libraries that you see, like React Basic and React with add-ons, and they allowed us to do different things. So what you did is the component that you see, you would define it by using react.create class, and what you did is you pass in an object to it which had information like, for example, in a previous case it had information of how many comments they are or how many likes the image has. So that kind of information you would store basically in the state that you see here, like get initial state, and then basically it had one mandatory method which is render. So one notable thing that you see here is which was pretty unconventional at that time or was controversial is that we are using HTML from within JavaScript. During that time it was more towards templating languages being used a lot, handlebars and those kind of things. So this kind of way of doing HTML from within JavaScript was kind of like pretty controversial when it was introduced. So we have a basic component which got created by create class, and then you just return what you want to display and handle how or what kind of information you want to display based on the state that you have within the basic component. So you pass your object that you want to render within create class, as well as you could pass external parameters to it by making use of props. Like here you have name being passed as an argument that you pass to React component. Before I proceed, I just wanted to get an idea of how many here are like familiar already with React and use it. Alright. So yeah, we had this kind of a structure, very basic. Just pass an object and create components, and then to actually display it on the DOM, you would pass it to render method, and you pass the component that you want to render and where you want to display it. And this whole thing, like that's it. That's the whole component that you have on a page. Instead of having a big MVC architecture, this was mostly only focused towards having the UI part, handling the UI parts of it, and it simplified. Like it did not try to do interactions between like model view or those kind of things, and just focused on the display aspects of the component. So here, it also based on these, it also allowed us to have like hooks or also allowed us to have view into what is actually happening within the React component. So it had a very basic life cycle that you see over here. It initialized. So what happens is like you create that component, it tries to mount it on the page, which happens during this initialization. You set this initial state via get initial state, and you get props. And then when it actually displays on the page, that process is called mounting. So you would mount the component on the page and actually display it. And then based on some external events like user clicking something, we have this event of updates being happening, or we can intercept those events by component should update, or these kind of various life cycle methods. So these, I don't want to focus more on these, but just want to give an idea of how the different life cycle was and how basic, like it was not too fancy, very basic, just initialization, update, and then when you actually remove the component, it would just unmount. So around 2014 or 2013, after React was introduced, this was the basic way of doing things. But around the same time, like ES6 or ECMAScript 6 and ES, which is like, but this made it like, okay, you are like thinking of the whole component in terms of a class. And then here, if you see, it just required one basic method or one mandatory method, which is render, and then you just return what you want to display on the page. Again, basic HTML from over here. Along with this, since like if you note over here, we are doing a lot of things. A lot of things might be done in the class. So since we already had the support of JSX, one way of doing things was that we did in various cases, you don't need like a lot of complex mechanism for display. Like you just need some parameters being sent, and based on those parameters, just display something. Don't handle like user clicks. Sorry, don't handle any complex stuff around components. So during that time, stateless or functional components were introduced. Like you could start doing this simpler way of things, like just pass props as a simple function. So we started using these arrow methods, and then here what you do is you just get the props. Based on the props, you just return basic JSX. That's it. So it allowed us to do like very complex stuff in a simpler way. So that's sort of about like how things were changing, like React was adopting to whole introduction to advanced features that the community was like improving around on the whole JavaScript parts of it. So let's take a look at how other things within React have changed around these past couple of years. So what I want to do is like kind of compare what used to be and how you do things now, right? How many of you were using React like when this whole use case was like create class, or this were used? Like how many people started it way back? Okay, nobody used. Others never used create class. You're lucky. So you had this way of doing things. You have an app, like you pass it, create class, and you. So this is like a change in how you initialize, which is when you have some state, which is like something which you want to mutate, and maintain some things like, okay, has the user clicked the button or not? These kind of things you would put it in the state, and then initially you would do it by get initial state, wherein you initialize it by something, and now what you do is you just set it via this dot state within your constructor, and then you can set any kind of object over here. And the way of changing it is same. You just still use this dot set state to update like whatever state you want to handle any kind of mutations. From that life cycle that we had initially, it has now simplified a little bit based on the new ways of using it, like the whole class way of doing React components. So instead of those lifecycle methods, now we have a simplified way of thinking of what is happening within when the React component is rendered. So we have like the mounting of the component, wherein you have the constructor that we just saw, we initialize the state, and then it calls the render method when it is trying to display the information, and then component did mount. Basically everything is same, but just the initialization part that you see, it has been more simplified based on the whole class way of doing components. How many of you know mixins over here? Okay, so this is for you people. So when React started, everything was in small parts, like you had small components, and as applications grew, a lot of things were scattered around. One way of sharing code, like if you had code regarding, let's say you have a chat application and you have 4 different parts of it, everyone needs to connect to the backend. So when you wanted to share code across components, one way of doing that was using mixins. So here if you see, this is like a basic mixin that you see above. What it basically has is it's just an object of different methods that you want to share across multiple components. So you would write this basic object which has multiple methods, and then what you would do is you would pass it to create class as a in the key which is mixins. And then what would happen is those functions would be made available within your new class that you have just created. And here you could then pass this same mixin to multiple other classes, and those methods again would be made available, or you could reuse the same functionality over there. Couple of problems with this approach is that these functions that you see, what they do is when you put them as mixin, they would collide with the existing methods that you had in the same class, or they, like over here if you see, it's assuming that internals state or the object which is created over here, it is always available. So it